All right, so we are almost at the end of our healing series. We've been talking through this now for like the last 3 or 4 weeks, and we've been taking an in-depth look at the healing that God has made available to us through Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. So can we do something fun together this morning to start out? If you have a piece of paper and a pen, or even just a note app on your phone, that's fine as long as you don't get distracted by your social media. What I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to give you a series of questions. I'm going to give you about 1 minute each to answer these questions, and I won't collect them, okay? So just so you know, nobody's going to see your answers. I'm not going to use them in your annual report. I'm not going to put them out on our social media pages. But this is just a fun way to kind of get us thinking about today's topic. All right, here's the first question. I'll give you 1 minute to write down your answers. In what areas of life, where did that go? In what areas of life do you normally try to exert some sort of control or influence? Some of you already look at me funny, like, oh, I have to answer that? I promise, I won't look. What areas of your life? Go ahead, write them down. Maybe it's your career, maybe it's your finances, maybe it's your kids, maybe it's relationships. I don't want to give you too much, but go ahead, start listing the areas of your life where you try, at least in some way, shape, or form, to exert some sort of control or influence. This is going to go somewhere, and it's not designed to make you feel guilty, I promise. I feel like I need the Jeopardy music in the background. All right. Now that you've had an opportunity to be honest, transparent with yourself about those areas of your life that you try to exert some sort of control or influence, here's my next question. What areas of life do you generally leave up to God's control? So compare that, right? What are the things that are part of your life or the life of others that you find it pretty simple to just like, nah, God's got that? Where are those areas that you're more likely to leave life up to God? And I'll warn you, if you have conflict, if there's the same thing on both lists, that might be an area of conflict you have with God right now. Just so you know, like if your list of control and influence overlaps with God's, there might be a bit of a question there. So, all right. So the first two questions were: what are some areas of your life that you normally try to exert some sort of influence? And then the second one is, what areas of your life do you generally leave up to God's control, his influence? Okay, last question. Now what I want you to do is compare. Go back over that list. And which ones, both of those lists that you made, which ones have the greatest impact on your everyday life? Some of you don't even like this last question, do you? So, which ones have the greatest impact? You can just put a little star next to it, an asterisk, whatever you want to do. So you take your first list, those things that you try to have some sort of control or influence over. And then you take the second list that you allow God to have some sort of control or influence, and then put a little star, asterisk, whatever you want, next to the ones that have everyday, like kind of your daily impact on life. I can tell by some of your smirks that most of us, in some way, shape, or form, we're usually able to leave the really big things to God, aren't we? Like those things we don't understand or can't understand about life. Like we're willing to leave like the future of the world to God, right? We're willing to leave like end times, most of us, to God. We're willing to leave like, when the next thunderstorm is going to show up. Like we don't try to control the thunderstorms typically. I mean, maybe some of you do. If you do, we can talk later. But like these kind of like big cosmic events in life, it's really easy to kind of leave those into God's control. Like, okay, God, you take care of that. I don't know what this winter is going to be like, but you do, right? But on the other hand, most of us try to exert some level of control or influence on those things that are really part of our everyday lives, don't we? Like, we think we have so much control over our options, our careers, our relationships, our schedules, right? Don't we? Like, we exert a fair amount. Like, I spend a lot of time. I'm an organizer. I'm a planner. I'm fairly detailed. Some of you that work on staff with me or in my family can testify that, like, my calendar is pretty detailed. And we try to have some sort of control or influence on those everyday aspects of our lives. And I just want to explain to you a little bit about why that is. Why do we spend so much time, energy, and effort trying to exert some sort of control or influence on our daily lives while leaving the big stuff up to God or what our version of God is? In the 1970s, a research psychologist named Ellen Langer, she identified this tendency in people, this kind of controlling tendency, and she called it the illusion of control. The illusion of control. She did kind of like a broad-based study of a bunch of different individuals who were kind of given some parameters, some examples, right? Some situations in life where they could try to control or not control. And if they thought they had any kind of influence whatsoever, like, here's one. Driving. So she discovered that people felt like they were less likely to get into an accident if they were the ones that are driving. They're like, I'm in control, I can do this, right? But studies show that accidents are accidents, right? They're random, right? Like, that's why they call them accidents. Or given the situation like with a lottery, right? Like, individuals think that they have a much higher chance of winning the lottery if you pick the numbers instead of somebody else giving them to you. But truth is, it doesn't matter. There's no difference in the two. And so this is her definition for the illusion of control that we as humans often live under. She says the tendency for human beings, this is the definition, the illusion of control is the tendency for human beings to believe that they can control or at least influence outcomes that they demonstrably have no influence over whatsoever. This is the illusion of control. And I'm telling you this, I'm not trying to give this to you from a biblical standpoint. This is like sociological, psychological reality, right? You can look it up. For like the last 50-some years, we've been coming under this realization that humans, we deceive ourselves. We're self-deceivers with regards to control. It's kind of like, now stick with me here, it's kind of like the shopping carts with the little like kid steering wheels. My kids used to love these growing up, right? So you plop the kid, you see the flames or whatever else, you drop your kid into the shopping cart, and they've got their hands on the wheel, and they're just going to town, like just loving life, right? All the while, mom and dad are just like, do-do-do-do-do, like driving through. You know what happens? Eventually, kids realize that thing's not connected, and they're not happy. This is the illusion of control that all of us in some way, shape, or form, we jump into the cart, we're like, yeah, we got this, right? And all along, there's these cosmic forces at work, I'll call them God, that is kind of guiding us through the aisles of our lives. And most of us, we live under this illusion. And even as adults, we have these kind of controlling tendencies, don't we? And don't they often do so much damage to our lives? This illusion of control, doesn't it have such a damaging effect on us personally and even our relationships? So the goal of today's message is to address the question, are we really in control? We've been talking about healing. We've been talking about wholeness. We've been talking about the opportunity that God gives to us through relationship with Jesus to find healing emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationally, like that we would be healed. And I submit to you that one of the most significant areas of the American life that we need some healing is in regards to control. And the question of whether or not we're in control. Because, think about this for a minute, the world wants us to think that we're in control, aren't we? I mean, think about the entire line of Apple products. iPhone, iTunes, like right? iBook, iMac, right? Like, or maybe YouTube, it's all about you. Right? Most of society in some way, shape, or form has become very I-centric. That we think in some way, shape, or form that we have control over our lives. All the while we don't realize how much we are influenced by those things that we think we have control over, how much illusion we're living under. You see, the need for control ultimately leads us to so much unhealth. Emotionally, you ever been so emotionally depleted because you've just spent so much time trying to keep things under control in your life? You ever experienced physical exhaustion because you just work and work and work and work and work and trying to make it better and it doesn't even seem to get better, and then you're like, what is the point of this, right? Or maybe relational, right? Like none of us like to feel like we're being controlled, but none of us want to let somebody else control us. And so we go through these like relational struggles that tie directly back to this question. Are we really in control, even spiritually, right? Like we talked about it last week when bad stuff happens in our lives. Like, God, this is not the right time, right? Can we adjust the schedule here? Ultimately, the need for control winds up controlling us. Sociologists, psychologists have done a study that the more an individual leans into their desire to control things around them, the more likely that desire for control begins to control them. That is the process. And the problem is, let me tell you why. The problem we kind of come up against and under this illusion of control is that you and I were never meant to carry the weight of controlling the uncontrollable things of life. We were never intended to carry the weight of control. It's too heavy. It costs too much. It weighs too much. But many of us have carried this burden for a long, long time, haven't we? The burden of control that we were never meant to carry. And one of the primary places that Jesus talks about this issue of control is in Matthew chapter 16. This is going to be our primary passage for this morning. But I think, I get the sense that Jesus understood the tendency of humans to want to control their environment, to control the uncontrollable, the illusion, right? Maybe clearly they hadn't done all the studies back in Jesus' day, but I sense that Jesus, he gets it, right? This illusion of control that we live under. So Matthew chapter 16, he addresses the question, who's really in control? Matthew 16:24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. That doesn't sound like a whole lot of control on our part, does it? We talked about this last week, that the wheneverness of suffering, the whoeverness of suffering, that suffering is no respecter of persons. And so what Jesus is saying to his closest friends, his disciples, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. There's very little control that is given in that moment, according to Jesus. Verse 25, for whoever wants to save their life, when you see the word save in this passage, read the word control. Let's just swap it out. So whoever wants to control their lives will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Whoever lets go of control of their lives for me will find it. Verse 26, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world? Isn't that what we're trying to do as we're controlling, right? Controlling our schedules and our people and our children and our jobs and our, careers and our futures and our health. Like, we're trying to gain the whole world. But what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their own soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Now, if you've been a part of the church for a while, you've probably heard these verses before. You probably heard Matthew 16, 24 to 26. And most of the time, we as preachers, it's described as kind of the cost of discipleship. What it costs to follow Jesus, like the taking up of the cross and the denying of self. And yes, that is true. That's actually what Jesus is talking about, the cost of discipleship. But we often lose context. We lose context about where this story comes from. Because the primary context that Jesus is talking about is control. It's letting go of control, the illusion of control. You see, Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 to 26, he's nearing the end of his life. Like, he knows that he's got at least an impression from his heavenly Father that the time is coming when he's going to have to give up his life. Like, he realizes that his time on earth is nearing the end. He spent almost 3 years with his closest friends at this point, known as his disciples, the apostles, right, the 12. And Jesus begins to teach his friends about what's coming. So let's look at a little bit of context, right? Matthew chapter 16, let's just go back a couple of verses. We started at 24 just a minute ago. Let's go back to 16:21. From that time on. Okay, let me give you just a little bit of an insight. As you're studying God's word, if you see something like that, from that time on, from that point on, if you see a phrase like that, it's important for you to go backwards, right? It's important for you to go back maybe a couple verses or even a whole chapter and figure out what time, right? Because this is like a turning point moment. So from that time, let's figure out what happened, right? What is that time? Peter had just a couple verses earlier, Peter had just declared Jesus to be the Messiah. If you look back just a couple verses earlier, Peter, after spending 3 years with Jesus, he finally gets it. Peter finally understands who Jesus really is. He declares Jesus to be the Messiah. And Jesus' response is twofold. One, it's an affirmation, and then two, it's a promise. His affirmation, Jesus says to him in Matthew 16, he says to Peter, hey, blessed are you because that didn't come from you, that came from God, right? God gave you the understanding of who I am. And then he gives Peter a promise. He says, on you, Peter, I will build my church. You've heard that before, right? So this is the setting that we're in for Matthew chapter 16. Peter, after almost 3 years, spending day and night with Jesus, watching all these incredible miracles, hearing all of these teachings, right? Watching all of these people come into a relationship with Jesus, he finally understands, oh, Jesus, you are the Messiah. So that is from that time on, right? The realization, that moment, when Peter, the first apostle to realize who Jesus really is and then speak it out loud. So that's the context. From that time on, from the time that Peter declared who Jesus really was, it says, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer. So think about this for a minute. Peter finally gets it. He declares it out loud. Jesus affirms the truth, and then Jesus' focus kind of changes, right? Jesus' focus changes to his future and to what's coming. So he begins to explain to them that his disciples, he must go to Jerusalem, he must suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter declares who Jesus really is. Jesus affirms that declaration, and then he begins to teach them, hey, this is what's coming. Now that you understand who I really am, this is what's coming. And you know what's coming, Jesus says? Suffering. Suffering is what Jesus warns his disciples. That he's going to be struck down, but he's not going to be destroyed. That he's going to be beaten, but not discarded. That he's going to be killed, but then he'll be raised to life. Suffering with a purpose. The first thing Jesus teaches to Peter and to his disciples after they finally realize who he is suffering with a purpose. Jesus is predicting, he's telling his closest friends, this is what's coming. When you get to verse 22 then, Peter, so this is Peter's response. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Okay, so what is Peter essentially trying to take control? He's trying to take control of the narrative. He's trying to take control of the story. Maybe he's afraid to lose his friend. Maybe he wants to avoid the suffering that Jesus talked about. But he tries to control the narrative of Jesus, the Messiah, right? That he just declared. I mean, this is the same conversation. Yes, it's in different sections in our Bible, but the exact same conversation. Peter goes, you're the Messiah, but I'm in control. Right? This is literally what Peter does. I feel so much better, just so you know, as a recovering control freak, right? Thanks, Pete, right? But this is what Peter does. And isn't that an awful lot like our own circumstances, right? Isn't that an awful lot like our own suffering? At the first sign of pain or hurt or things just not turn out the way we thought they were going to, what do? We just grab on with white knuckles and try to control. It's exactly what Peter does. Pete's like, oh no, you just told me that I'm going to be the head of the church. And so, right, Pete's just I'm in charge now, right? This is the illusion of control that sociologists and psychologists are talking about. This is the illusion of control that every single one of us are living under, as exemplified by Peter. No, he says, never, Lord. This shall never happen to you. How does Jesus respond? Verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Wow. That's rough. I mean, Pete just declared Jesus as the Messiah, and then, Jesus says, oh yeah, that's great. God gave you that On you I will build my church. And then literally same conversation. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. This is the strongest rebuke that Jesus ever gives to one of his apostles. I mean, this is some strong language. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Jesus immediately recognizes Peter's attempt to take control, right? Jesus, instantaneously goes, whoa, you're not taking control of this narrative, right? And do you know why? And this is true for Peter, and it's true for us. All attempts at control over the uncontrollable things put us immediately against God. Have you seen that? All attempts at controlling the things in our lives that are uncontrollable put us in enmity with God. We are enemies of God in this moment. That's exactly what Peter does, unknowingly, because he tries to take control. And look at Jesus' words, specifically. I'm going to break them out for you. It says, Jesus said specifically to Peter in verse 23, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. This is the great problem of trying to control the uncontrollable. We are not God. We were never intended to carry the weight of control. We were never meant to be the ones who were controlling the narrative. And Jesus says right here that this is the crux of the illusion of control, because you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. This is Jesus' version of helping us understand the illusion of control that all of us are living under. Peter even thought that he was doing the right thing. Peter clearly thought that he was trying to help Jesus. But can I ask you something? What if Peter had succeeded in that moment? You ever thought about that? What if Peter's attempt to control the narrative of Jesus had actually succeeded? I mean, Peter stands up and says, no, that's never going to happen to you. You're never going to suffer, not on my watch, right? In essence, all of humanity would have been lost had Peter assumed control of the situation. The truth is that you and I were never meant to be in control of the uncontrollable. We were never meant to be in control of the uncontrollable, because we don't know what God knows. We can't see what God sees. We can't understand what God understands. But it doesn't stop us from trying, does it? It doesn't stop us from trying to play God. So, where does this tendency to control come from? Why are we living under this illusion of control? Why do we struggle so much? Well, in the book of James, we talked about James just last week, but James, the brother of Jesus, chapter 4, he answers this question, where this tendency to control comes from. He says, what causes fights and quarrels? James 4, 1 through 3. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? So James is referring to this internal struggle that all of us have that manifests itself in the desire to control. So what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desire that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and you fight. Does that sound anything like America right now? Okay. Verse 3, when you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. At the core of this issue of control is the sin nature. It's the fallen mankind. The desires, literally, that James put, the desires that we have within us that war with ourselves. This is the sin nature. This is the condition of all of mankind since sin entered into the world. We decided that we wanted to control. And built into the human DNA is this need for control. So James is telling us, we have this sin nature that drives us to want to control. But then, did you see the byproduct of it? Did you see the byproduct of this desire to control, fights, arguments, even taking people's lives, right? We know what humanity looks like when we're just scrapping for control, don't we? We understand it in our culture. We understand it in our marriages. We understand it in ourselves. Some of us fight our own battles internally for control. Because, please understand this, our sin nature demands control. Our sin nature demands control. Our unredeemed selves, the deepest desire that our sin nature carries is to control the influence, the outcome, the direction of our lives. In the very same way, our sin nature, it begins to kind of take control of our stories. Like James talks about, we don't even ask God. I mean, go back to the situation with Peter and Jesus from Matthew chapter 16. James refers to this question that when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get. Right? Verse 2, he talks about that we don't even ask. Had Peter even asked a question, things might have been a little different, right? If Peter took Jesus aside after Jesus declares the suffering that's about to come, and he says, hey, Jesus, is this really what you want? Like, is this really what God wants? But he doesn't. Peter doesn't even ask a question. James refers to it like we don't even ask God if this is what the plans he has. In this very same way, our sin nature begins to take control over us. And then just a couple verses later, in the same book, James chapter 4, he tells us how this is kind of manifested in our lives. James 4:13, he says, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Doesn't sound like that. Like that's humanity, right? That's what we do. We're like, I'm just going to go get a job over there and I'm going to set my family up here. We make plans with our lives. We make plans with our future. We make plans with our families. We make plans with our careers so often without ever seeking God. Without asking God if that's what he wants for our lives. And then when things don't turn out the way that they're supposed to, we grow discouraged and disoriented, fearful, jealous, even angry. And then you know what the next step is? We try to take control even more. Because this is the danger of the illusion of control. The more we try to control, the more control controls us. The more the need for control controls us. So James is saying like, hey, this is what humans, apart from Jesus, this is what we do. We just kind of set up our lives and then ask God to bless it. Verse 14, why you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. That's such a like in-your-face line. Hey, can you tell me what the temperature is going to be like tomorrow? I mean, for real? Can you tell me exactly when the first ray of sunshine is going to hit your front porch? Can you tell me exactly what work is going to be like for you tomorrow? James is saying, hey, you don't even know what tomorrow is going to look like. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little and then vanishes. Wow. James is getting real. But what he's saying is we forget how small we are in comparison to God. Our illusion for control makes us look bigger than we really are. Verse 14, James is reminding us that our lives are but a fog that disappears with the sun in comparison to God. One of the things that my family and I love most about living in Countersport is the natural beauty that's all around us. And one of my favorite places to be is like first thing in the morning, before the sun comes up, before anybody else gets out of bed, I love to sit in my living room and look out the giant bank of windows and just wait. And do you know that a significant portion of the time when I wake up, I can't even see the mountains because there's so much fog. Sometimes I can't even see the tree that's in my yard. And there's such beauty about that. And to me, it's a reminder of the brevity of our lives, the limitedness of our control, that I couldn't even necessarily find my way to my tree first thing in the morning. So can I ask you a question? Would you be willing to leave the control of your life to the fog that shows up in town so often? Would you be willing to leave the decisions of your future, your family, your career, your relationships, every decision in the future of your life, would you be willing to leave it to the fog? Would you be willing to wake up in the morning and go, hey, fog, just want to let you know, this is here's my schedule, here's my family, here's my future. Take care of this for me. The answer is pretty simple. No, right? As far as I know, none of us ask the fog what to do with our day. And yet, you and I try to take control of our lives. When James says we're just the fog. Every time we try to take control of the uncontrollable parts of our lives, we're proving the truth that we were never meant to have control, that we're but a fog. You wouldn't trust your future to the fog, but you trust yourself with it, don't you? Verse 15. James gives us a bit of an antidote to this control. He says, instead, this is James' recommendation for those of us who struggle with controlling tendencies. You ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this and do that. If it is the Lord's will. Doesn't that sound a lot like Jesus' command in Matthew chapter 16, where we started out this morning? I mean, Jesus said to his disciples, whoever, that's you and I, as followers of Christ, if we want to be disciples, we must deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus. Deny our rights, deny our authority, deny our power, deny control. Even the illusion of control, that we would deny those things and that we would voluntarily choose to suffer, even as Jesus warned, right? Jesus is saying that he's about to suffer, that suffering's a part of life. What Jesus is inviting us to do is to surrender ourselves to a God who controls the uncontrollable. To give up the control of our lives. Jesus goes on to say, for whoever, there's that word again, whoever wants to save, control their lives, will lose it. But whoever loses control of their life will find it. Loses control of their life to Jesus. Let's just make sure I get that in there. Surrender control. You see, this is our human condition, that all of us live under this illusion that somehow we can control some aspect of our lives. But have you ever noticed that the more we try to control our lives, the more out of control we feel? That's because control is an illusion. And I share this with you. The only real control that we have is who we choose to surrender our lives to. The only genuine, real control that you and I have is who we choose to surrender our lives to. We think we can control our schedules. We think we can control our kids. We think we can control our careers and our futures. We think we can control where we live and how long we live there. But you and I, we are but the fog that dissipates with the morning sun. Because the only real control that we have is who we surrender our lives to. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick list of some warning signs that you may or may not like these. So I respect this. I'll say it in advance. But if you're not sure whether you struggle with control, let's just take a look, right? If you're not sure if you struggle with control, I'm going to suggest that here are some warning signs. Maybe you've got some irritability or hypersensitivity. What that means is like kind of a simple, kind of everyday bad thing happens and like it explodes either inside of you or outside of you. That's called irritability or hypersensitivity. The moment that one thing doesn't go exactly as you planned, like there's this like huge response inside of you. Just maybe you have some control issues. I'm just going to say. Okay, second one. This one's a little bit more personal. If you find yourself keeping score in your relationships often, like, well, I did this, but they didn't do that in return, right? If you've got a mental checklist of the score that you're keeping in your relationships, you might have some control issues. I'll just say it out loud. Another one. Compulsive overworking. You know why many of us work so hard? Because we're trying to control the uncontrollable. We're trying to influence the uninfluenceable. We're trying to secure our future. We're trying to prove our worth. Here's another one. Maybe there's some highly critical thoughts or words, either aimed at yourself or other people. You hear yourself say something to yourself and like, ooh, that was mean to me, right? Like, or to somebody else, right? So often these highly critical thoughts or words, either they come out of your mouth or they're in your brain. It's because you're trying to control something that's completely uncontrollable. And so you're like, oh, well, if this isn't working, I'm going to try shame. I'll just shame myself into feeling better, right? You understand how, like, self-debasing that is? How yeah. So, irritability, hypersensitivity, keeping score, compulsive overworking, highly critical thoughts or words. You guys are wishing I would stop this really quick. Here's the next one. Escapist behaviors, right? This means like that you see these environments in your life where like you just can't handle what's going on, and so you escape, maybe into food or into Netflix or into shopping or into alcohol or into something else that's designed to like help you to deal with life. Because things are out of control, you don't know what to do, so I'm just going to control my binging on Netflix, right? Like, when these escapist behaviors begin to show up in our lives, it's because we're afraid of losing control, often. Here's another one. Hoarding our energy. This is an interesting one. You ever thought to yourself, oh, I don't have energy for this. Oh, I can't handle this. Now, I'm not saying you can't be really careful with your investments, right? And how much time and energy you put into certain things. But if you find yourself in many areas of your life hoarding energy, not being willing to give away because you're afraid that you won't get it back, maybe there's some control issues. Last one, ordering the lives of others. Sorry. One of the most significant expressions of the illusion of control in our lives isn't just that we're trying to control ourselves, we can try to control the people around us. Our spouses, our friends, our families, our coworkers. Now let me say to you, if there's like 2, maybe 3 or more of these that are happening in your life on a regular basis, you have control issues. If 2 or 3 or more of these happening in my life, I have control issues, right? This is the manifestation of the need for control within our human selves. And so I'll leave you with this question. How should we then respond? If we recognize that we're trying to control the uncontrollable, if we recognize the pain it's causing in our lives and the lives of those around us, if we recognize that God never intended us to be in control, then how do we respond? I'll give you some suggestions. Number 1 is to create solitude. Nothing dissipates the fog faster than getting alone with God. Nothing resizes us faster than spending quality time alone with Jesus. So let me ask you, where, and specifically geographically, where do you feel most connected with God in life? Like, where's that place? Where are the places in your life that you can go to regularly to experience the bigness of God and the smallness of yourself? That's what it means to create solitude. For me, there's a mountain nearby. I won't tell you where it is because I don't want y'all showing up. And there's a spot that I go to on a fairly regular basis that I can see literally for miles as long as there's no fog. And I get there and I just have to like stop and recognize how small I am compared to the bigness of God. You see, when we struggle with control issues, we need God to help resize us. Our perspectives, our understandings of who He is and who we are. And that can really only happen in solitude. When we're busy and stressed out and running and keeping all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and what happens is we lose sight of how insignificant we are. We lose sight of the fact that we are but a mist, as James says. So getting away, creating solitude, it forces us to come to the realization that we are not in charge. Mark 6:31, you don't have to look it up, but Jesus said to his disciples, "Then because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat." You ever say that to yourself? I didn't even eat today. This happened to the disciples in Mark chapter 6. Like, they were so busy in ministry they didn't even have a chance to eat. And what does Jesus say to them? "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Mark 6:31. Jesus himself invited his own disciples in the midst of their busyness, "Come away with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." First realization, first step after we realize that we're struggling under control is creating solitude. And here's a quote that I love. It says, "Come apart lest you fall apart." I tried to look, I looked all over trying to figure out where this came from. But there's truth in this. Come apart. Come away with Jesus lest we fall apart. It's what Jesus invited his disciples in Mark 6:31. Come away with me. Find rest. The second one is commit to silence. First, it starts with creating solitude, but the second is to commit to silence. The quieting of one's mind and soul. Psalm 46:10, I read it to you this morning. "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in all the earth." We live in such a busy and distracted and hurried and noise-filled world. And you and I, if we're going to let go of control, we must reclaim the discipline of silence. One way you could do that, just check the usage history on your phone. Go to the battery setting and see how much time or energy you spent on which aspect of your phone this week. Ask yourself this question: how much silence am I giving to God every single day? Because there's a direct correlation between our silence and our willingness to give control back to God. So go back to your list from this morning. Go back to those first 3 questions. And would you take that list with you into your silence and solitude this week? Would you lay that list before God in a quiet moment and just say, "God, is there anything on here that needs to be reordered? Is there anything on this list that needs to change?" And then just wait and listen and see what God has to say to you. Because the only real control that we have is who we choose to surrender our lives to. That's it. The fullness of control is who we choose to surrender our lives to. Can we pray? Jesus, I take a lot of comfort in Peter's response. Because Peter's response looks an awful lot like my own. At the first sign of pain or suffering or confusion or hurt, I want to wrap my hands around it and control it. And so, Father, we confess to you today that we are a people who struggle with control issues. And we need you to reset us, to reframe us, to restore us, to teach us what it means to let go, to teach us what it means to deny ourselves and to take up our cross, trusting that you are the God who controls the uncontrollable. This is our prayer. Amen.